Professor Nam, thank you for meeting with me today.
My pleasure.
I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about your 2004 article that appeared in Population Research and Policy Review, which dealt with the Nam-Powers-Boyd Index that you have pioneered and developed with some of your colleagues. Thinking back to when you first started working on this idea of an index, what was the context that led you to start innovating this new idea well, it wasn't new, but to develop this index?
Well, in a sense, you have to go back to 1950 when I completed my undergraduate degree at New York University and took a job with the Census Bureau as a junior professional. And they assigned me to the Population Division in the Social Statistics branch under Paul Glick. And they assigned me to the Education section. There was a fellow who headed it up, and I was to be his assistant. Well, after a little while, he left the Bureau, and they didn't want to hire another man in that place, so they turned to me and said, why don't you continue running the Education section until the 50 census period was over, which I did. But then in 1952, they had to reduce the force of people working on the census, and I was let go. I went on to get my master's and doctorate at the University of North Carolina, and when I finished in 1959, 58 actually, the Census Bureau asked me if I would like to come back because they had just set up a new branch called the Education and Social Stratification branch, and I took the position. And educational data had already existed for some time there. The question is what would be under social stratification. And Paul Glick, who was then my boss, gave me a free rein in trying to develop stuff. Well, I was quite familiar with the history of occupational data in the census. And if you go back to the late 19th century, a man named William Hunt, who had been with the Bureau of Labor Statistics and then Census Bureau, was interested in the occupational data, and he, based on his own perceptions, classified them in different categories, and that was the beginning of a socioeconomic classification of occupations. Then in 1930, another census employee named Alba Edwards picked up with Hunt's work, and by that time there were more categories of occupation, and Edwards, based on his own views of the socioeconomic status of occupations, classified them and put them into major occupational groups. So when I came along in before the 1960 census, I looked back at that and said to Paul Glick, here we can kind of pick up where Edwards left off, but now we had better ways of classifying occupations because there was information on education and income in the later censuses, and that's where it all got started.
What other kinds of measures like this already existed at that time? Just those ones from the Census Bureau? When did Duncan and these other people get into the game?
A number of community surveys have been conducted by Hollingshead and others,
right,
in which they included indicators. Again, it was based mostly on perceptions of occupations, and it was restricted to certain communities which may not have had general applicability to the larger population.
So whoever was doing the work made the categories, pretty much.
Right, exactly.
Yes. Now you sort of spearheaded the team that developed this document that the Census Bureau put out and led to the first kind of scale for this. But who else was on this team and who was working with you? Who were you in contact with when you were doing this work?
Well, the idea was originally mine, but in order to get something done at the Census Bureau, they're not known for being innovative, and I had to sort of fight my way to get this information recognized. Paul Glick, my mentor there, and my assistant at the time was Ed Stockwell at the Census Bureau, who later became a very well-known demographer. And I pursued it with the assistance of Stockwell and with the approval of my bosses up the line, Paul Glick and Henry Shryock. And at first, they were kind of hesitant to sponsor this, and I kept pressing them on it. Conrad Teuber was then the assistant director for the Census Bureau for Demographic Studies, and he was interested in, but he was also kind of hesitant to sponsor it.
Do you have any idea about their reluctance? Why were they?
Well, as I said before, it was something new, and the census wasn't known for introducing new things to a great extent. And there was also a concern, for example, Teuber said, well, if you base your classification on education and income correlates of occupations, what happens to rural occupations where the income isn't quite the same as it would be for urban occupations, and things of that sort. But I kept modifying this classification till I finally satisfied him and the others. And with the 1960 census coming up, they agreed to not only publish information, but even produce a special report of the 1960 census on socioeconomic classifications of occupations.
So the pushing did some good. What motivated you? Where do you think this came from for you personally to get out in front of this and try to convince these other people? Did this come from people that you had talked to at university? Did it just come out of thin air? Or
well, I mentioned that the position that they hired me for was the branch chief of education and social stratification. And so I was wondering, how can I advance the social stratification part of it? And this led me to look back at the earlier work of Hunt and Edwards and bring it up to date.
But had they used education and income as a way to systematically define these occupations or to measure them?
Well, of course, somebody like Albert Edwards, the education income data wasn't available in the earlier censuses. And so I had a chance to validate what Edwards was trying to do, but using the education and income data.
So it was pretty much an original idea to just use education and income to calibrate the occupations.
Yes.
In the article in Population Research and Policy Review, you give a very clear comparison of some of the different kinds of indices that we have about occupations. And you talk about the socioeconomic measures versus reputational measures. I wonder if you could say a word about how reputational ratings for occupations got started and what that had to do with your work at the time.
Well, I mentioned before the community studies that had been done, such as Hollingshead's, which is based largely on reputational kinds of estimates of occupational standing. But I was interested in the socioeconomic basis of occupations. And at the time, there were the National Opinion Research Center, NORC, at the University of Chicago, in the annual surveys that they did, had people rank 75 or so occupations according to their perceptions of the status of occupations.
So just subjective impressions.
Prestige basis, largely.
But is there any system to how you decide who gets to do the rating? Who did they use to do the ratings?
The people who were in the survey sample, basically.
Okay, so it was a representative sample.
National survey, yes, right. But the fact is that I was aware that they weren't using any education or income justification for these. These are how people perceived the occupations.
Yes,
And
college professors always did really well on those reputational measures, even
Right.
though we don't make any money.
And some occupations have low income but high perceived status,
Yes.
and others the reverse. And so it makes a difference as to whether or not you're using a reputational basis, as you say, or whether you're using a more level of living type of indicator.
Now, you mentioned that in the article that Duncan's SEI index is probably the most widely known index of this sort, and it has a reputational component in it. What are these different indices good for?
Well, let me comment about the Duncan index that you refer to, because at the time that I was developing the occupational scale at the Census Bureau, Duncan almost simultaneously was developing his socioeconomic index of all occupations classification, and he required access to census data because he was using information on education and income of occupations to predict what the NORC prestige items was showing.
And did it predict?
And he came to the Census Bureau frequently. Well, because I was developing this independent classification, he and I sat down frequently to compare notes. And we both appeared before our superiors at the Census Bureau. And so I was quite aware of what he was doing, and he was aware of what I was doing. And but he was representing the prestige dimension or reputational dimension.
Right.
But he was using the socioeconomic indicators to predict what the prestige would be. I was, on the other hand, using education and income more directly, not to estimate prestige, but rather level of living, I would call it.
If you ask people about subjective ratings of prestige and then predict prestige using education and income, do you get the same results?
No, you do not. and that was a failing of a lot of research going on at the time. People assumed it didn't make any difference which approach you use. You would come out at the end with the same information. I subsequently did a research paper, which never got published, but is accessible, that compares those two indicators along with a third one, which was done more directly prestige from the NORC data, and showed the difference in the kinds of scores or estimates of standing that you get from these three different directions.
Right. Graduate students routinely get to look at that paper, which is why I asked you about it. I wanted you to be sure and mention that. What has been the response to the Nam-Powers-Boyd scale in terms of adoption by other people in research and that sort of thing? What have you heard about this since it came out and since it's been revised several times? What's been the general reaction to it, do you think?
Well, first of all, you have to have occupational data in your database to use it. It was used quite a bit, and a real stimulant to its use came from the book by Miller and Solkind, which was an index to all methodologies in social sciences, and that got a lot of attention. But as different articles got published using this scale, we got all kinds of inquiries about it, and it kind of mushroomed after that.
You mentioned that you'd also updated this to 2010, not only the 2000 census covered in this article, but the 2010 census. What kind of issues arose from that process, and where does it stand today?
Okay, and let me back up a little bit on that, because I mentioned Ed Stockwell and Paul Glick as having worked with me on the initial work in this area. Subsequently, when Stockwell left to go into academia, Mary Powers joined the Census Bureau and became my assistant. And she worked with me on it some. Then when I came to Florida State University, I had a graduate student named E. Walter Terry.
Yeah.
And Terry wanted to do his doctoral dissertation on something of interest, but he wasn't sure what he wanted to do. So I got him to do an analysis of the socioeconomic classification that I developed. And as a result, he and I worked on 2 successive censuses using our classification. And then after that, Monica Boyd, who had been a colleague of ours here at Florida State, showed interest in it. She had done some work in Canada on it, and she became my associate in developing the 2010 classification. So one problem about the 2010 classification was, in the interim between 2000 and 2010, the Census Bureau dropped the long form of the census, which had all the education and income data that we required. And so we had to turn to other sources, and we went to the basic survey, which had replaced the long form, and we used 3 years of that. It was an annual survey.
The American Community Survey?
American Community Survey. And we based it on 2009, 10, and 11 to get a 3-year average of it, give us enough cases. And we developed that. And in addition, we thought, well, we need to be able to advertise this better than we had. And so we decided on doing a website to instruct people how to use the data and to give them access to relevant information. And that website is in existence now. It's, if you go to NPB, standing for Nam Powers Boyd, NPB-SES.info, I-N-F-O. And you can get our website, which goes back and gives you links to all the past scores, and gives instructions on how to make use of the 2010 scores, and gives some other tips on how to find the classifications. For example, if your occupation that you do in a survey has an odd kind of a title, what is an equivalent in the census classification? And we instruct on that as well.
So this could be useful for 2020 when we have the 2020 results.
We're planning on doing it for 2020. It'll take a few years after the census before all.
You'll need the 21 ACS and so on.
But the American Community Survey would be the source again.
Right. Okay, thank you very much.